Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review. I'm Liz Booker, a retired Coast Guard helicopter pilot and writer for children and young adults. While I knew I wanted to be a pilot when I was 5 years old, I confess I did not know anything about the women who went before me, and even as a newly qualified pilot in my late 20s. Then one day, I met the wife of one of the rescue swimmers I was flying with at my first operational unit. Her name was Amy Goodpaster Strebe. She was in grad school working on her master's thesis, which was a comparative study of the women Air Force service pilots and the Soviet women who flew during World War II. I knew nothing about either of these groups at the time, but I can tell you the names WASP and Night Witches stuck with me for the next decade until I had the opportunity to meet some of these women at the Women in Aviation International Conference. Around the same time, I learned that Amy had published her thesis, entitled it Flying for Her Country, the American and Soviet Military Pilots of World War II. In March of 2021, I did a series of interviews with authors whose works feature these World War II women in honor of Women's History Month, and I had the opportunity to interview Amy about her book. That month, I also interviewed Elizabeth Wein, who has written several young adult historical fiction novels featuring women who flew during the war, and one nonfiction book, 1,000 Sisters, the Heroic Airwomen of the Soviet Union in World War II. In June of 2022, we did something a little different in the Aviatrix Book Club. We paired Elizabeth Wein's nonfiction book about this history with a fabulous historical fiction novel, The Huntress, by New York Times and USA Today best-selling author Kate Quinn, who is my guest today. You can find Kate at her website, katequinnauthor.com, on Instagram at katequinn5975, and on Twitter at katequinnauthor. Kate Quinn, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
Oh, I'm so delighted to talk to you. I have been looking forward to this for months, and this book is incredible. And I'm so excited that someone with your stature in the writing world and with your fascination with history was willing to bring it to a history that's very near and dear to me and to my audience, which is women in aviation, and particularly the Night Witches. I would love to hear, well, before we get started with that, would you give us an overview of the book for anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it?
Absolutely. In a nutshell, this novel, The Huntress, it tells the story of three very different people. A battle-weary British journalist turned Nazi hunter, a budding teenage photographer, and a Russian female bomber pilot from the all-women regiment known as the Night Witches, who team up in pursuit of a German woman war criminal who has gone to ground in post-war Boston. That's it in a nutshell.
That is it in a nutshell, and in a very small nutshell, I'll be honest, because it's so rich and so fascinating. I love this book so much. I'm so curious about your path to writing historical fiction. How did you get into writing, and tell me about your interest in history?
Well, it really is, I think, just a product of my particular childhood. I am lucky enough that my mother is a librarian and also has a degree in ancient and medieval history. So not only did I grow up around books, but I grew up learning in a very casual, very fun way, all kinds of things about the past. And that was my bedtime stories rather than, the Disney Channel. So that's what I grew up with, and it's what it fascinated me from an early age. So really, as soon as I began writing stories of my own, which was only when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I automatically gravitated toward the past, and I never really have come out of it as far as what I am drawn to write.
I think that is amazing. I was the girl on my belly in the living room reading the encyclopedia when I was little, so I can totally relate to that too. Just being exposed to so many fascinating things.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so one of the things I'm super fascinated about is how people's interests and skills come together to tell these amazing stories. So tell me about the inception of this idea for this book and your interest, how you wove in or how you decided to weave in the Night Witches.
Well, it actually came about because, I was thinking of what book would be following up with my novel, the Alice Network, which had come out and had done well. And I knew my publisher wanted something in the similar vein of, women's stories and, the 20th century, something around the world wars. And there's so much there. There will never be, we'll never run out of stories in that. So I was looking for something that would really grab me. And I did come up with the idea of the hunt for a war criminal in post-war America. And so I had my characters, which was all based on real history, which is in part the team of war crimes investigators who are launching this hunt. And then there is, the family unsuspecting in post-war America who has welcomed all unknown, a war criminal into their family. And this actually is based on real history because the very first war criminal who was ever extradited from the United States to stand trial for war crimes was a woman. And she was found living as a housewife in Queens, New York after the war, which I just found astounding and jaw-dropping in so many ways. And I had that story and I had that ready to go, but at the same time, I kept thinking, it's missing something. And I don't know what that is. It's missing that element that, really I later sort of identified, which is the thing that really fascinates me as a whole, is it's missing the badass female character, the woman who has done something jaw-dropping, probably during a war, maybe during some other time of crisis. That's what tends to be the thing that really lights me up. So it's like, it needs that. I'm just not sure what. So there I am on a 2 a.m. Google hunt, going down rabbit holes, reading articles right and left. And I happened to run across an article about the Night Witches. And I think I had heard of them before, but it was a case of they ran across my mind and across literally my screen at just the right time. And I just thought, bingo, that's it. I do not know how I'm going to make this fit, the story of the war crimes investigation and the story of a woman night witch pilot, but I'm going to make it fit somehow. I just don't know how. So there was a lot of jigsawing. As I was sort of, doing this with my plot elements and tried to make them fit. But finally they did. And that was how I ended up with the overall sort of triple-stranded plot that is the Huntress.
Oh my gosh, done by a master too, because you incorporated it so well. So it's so well done. One of the things that I loved about the book is when I was finished, I got to read the back matter, where you kind of talk about the inspiration and the interest in the Nazi hunting. And one of the things that I was amazed by, so I had read one book. It was a comparative study of the night witches and the women Air Force service pilots during World War II. And so I had sort of an overview and a little bit of knowledge about them. And of course, I recognized characters' names that you sort of dropped in to this book along the way. But in the book club this month, we decided that we were going to pair your fiction with a nonfiction done by Elizabeth Wein, A Thousand Sisters. And going back, I read hers after yours, and hers, it's like you incorporated so much more actual factual history, so many rich details, and you did it so well. I want to, all of the characters are so well drawn. The Huntress herself is this really evil sort of antagonist in the book, but I love Nina. So can we talk about Nina? Tell me how you pulled this together.
Well, it was a matter of, and I love Elizabeth Wein, and I love her fiction so much, and I have a feeling that for her nonfiction about the Night Witch pilots, we probably read some of the same sources, which is why we have, you saw the same anecdotes in both of our books. One of the ones I really leaned on was a particularly good compilation of interviews done, I think, in the 1990s with the surviving Night Witch pilots, of which there is a surprising amount. And my personal theory for that is that if you manage to survive World War II and the level of flying and the number of sorties that these women were flying, there's honestly not much that can kill you. So if they survived that, they would be old. And there were a lot of them in the 90s.
I know. I got to meet some of them, to be honest. So yeah.
Oh, I'm so jealous. I did not have a chance to do that. The book of interviews is the closest that I got, and that really was the thing that fascinated me so much, because these women are telling these stories from their wartime experiences, and you would see a picture of, some cheery cheeked young woman who's maybe 19 years old in a flight uniform, with, her apple cheeks and her star on her shoulder. And then you would see this babushka, in her 80s or something along those lines, also with the apple cheeks and with the star on her cardigan. And she would be saying something like, very matter of factly, like, oh, sometimes the bomb sticks on the rack. So, you just get your navigator to climb out on the wing and, you lay it flat and give it a push until it falls off. And I'm just sitting there going, you women are crazy. You are all nuts. That is absolutely going in the book. So really, that was like so much of what I wrote really came from them. And Nina herself, who is my fictional Night Witch pilot, and she is a composite in many ways of some of the real women who were part of the Night Witches. One of them did describe, for example, how she lived in a tiny village in Siberia, and she didn't, she had never even seen a plane before until a mail plane came down, touching down with some engine trouble, and she watched the pilot fix it, and she thought, like, I've got to investigate this further. I want to fly. And then there was another story of another two women young women who literally sort of planted themselves outside a male aviation officer's office in the building until just to get them off his doorstep. He said, okay, I'll get you an interview so you can get, interview for the position for being trained as one of the one of the regiments that was being put together. And, these are, and, a lot of the other stories in the war, like, the navigator who climbed out in a wing and, pushed a bomb off the rack when it was stuck, or the time when the ladies, had, everybody had a little bit of wine, I think, at, a holiday dinner, and they all got very, very drunk very quickly because they hadn't had alcohol in so long. And then they had to scatter and climb the planes into the sky and, all completely tanked. And, they were flying, and one described how she was so drunk, she was like playing games with another plane that was flying below, like they're waving wings at each other. And then she realized it was their shadow against the cloud. And just things like that were so great that I ended up using so many of the real stories, to create the character that was Nina, and then to create her experiences during the war for the book.
And what a fun way to bring that history to the world. And of course, with your reputation and the fact that you've sold so many books, so many more people get to read that story that would never have been exposed to it before now. It's wonderful. We're very grateful for that. You talked about some of the fun things. So what was your favorite thing about writing this book? Like, what surprised you or just brought you the most joy in crafting it?
I really loved writing Nina's perspective. You probably heard writers talk before about what happens when characters, sort of come alive on you. And that is true. That does happen. But it has rarely happened as strongly to me as it happened when Nina sort of came barnstorming into the book. I mean, it really was much less about me writing her story, and it was much more like she was living her life and generally shouting over her shoulder at me and telling me to keep up. That is honestly how it felt, sort of writing her particular story. And I've rarely enjoyed a character more. I think in part because, Nina is one of those people, she has no filter and she has no brakes. She lives her life, kind of like her plane, which also had no brakes. She lives her life at top speed, and there's very little she is afraid of. And that is not me at all. I live a very safe and constrained little life, as most writers do. It takes place on a couch, and there's a lot of imagination that goes on up here, and that's great. But I am not ever going to have the kind of high octane life that Nina has. And so it's fun to be able to step into those shoes.
Oh, and everything you said about her being alive in your mind is so evident on the page too. Like, she's just so vivid. They all are, but she is particularly for me, and all of her badassery. This all the way from her childhood throughout the story to the very end. It's just awesome. I want to know, we're going to get into your other work later, but like, in terms of the craft of this book, You have told this you've used two of my absolute favorite craft elements, which are multiple perspectives and nonlinear storytelling. And I have recently dabbled. I've dissected a book that was, it started off as a dual perspective novel, and I have elected to make it a single perspective, but that was so much work. And I was telling that story in a linear fashion. So I want to know how you do that. How do you do that as an author? Do you write their stories individually and then try and tie them all together and then chop them up? Tell me how that works.
For the Huntress, which does have three different perspectives and three different storylines, and because they're all happening, at least in the beginning, in slightly different points. I actually did end up writing, cutting back and forth between the three as I was going. I do know other authors who do the thing that you describe where, you write each thread separately and then you sort of have a grading session and intercut them later. I found it was easier for me to cut back and forth as I was going, because in this particular book, it made it easier for me to tease out the parallels that are happening between the timelines and to sort of drop the breadcrumbs of, clues to the readers if I was sort of going linear, at least on the page. So that's how I did it for this particular book. I have done it differently for other books of mine where I have done much more. I'll do almost all of one timeline here and then almost all of the other, and then I'll cut them together. But for the Huntress, it did help to cut back and forth as I was going between the timelines. For one thing, most of the timelines here don't entirely, they're not that far apart. The beginning starts in 1950, which is the one that's the most recent in time. And then you see a few years before where there's some events that are leading up to the 1950 timeline. And then you also see Nina, who you have met in one timeline already, but then you cut back in time to see how did she get to where she ultimately ends up. And so all these things, sort of wove together for me and ended up, it was a balancing act, I have to admit, because I had done a dual timeline before, but I had not done a triple timeline. And I think my muse had sort of decided, you can do this. It'll be easy. You already did 2. 3 won't be that much harder. And this is when midway through the book, I'm telling my muse, if you ever have a bright idea like that again, I'm locking you in the basement.
I'm glad to hear you say that because you certainly made it look easy. And, I kind of, I could maybe see how, especially in this book, the way if you were writing a single perspective novel, you would drop in a little backstory here and there. And that kind of feels like what happens when we do those flashbacks. It's just a longer form bit of backstory that we're getting to explain what's happening now.
No, I think that is true. It is, you can do flashbacks if you're doing a single perspective and that'll give you more. But I have always liked not just doing, it's not multiple timelines itself, but I have always liked having multiple viewpoints. Because when you have only one viewpoint, then you're only limited to whatever one person can see. And I have always liked to open the world of a book up so that we have multiple perspectives and we have suddenly a much enlarged world because you have in this book 3 different people can see. And that does mean that the world is much bigger for exploration.
And for me as a reader, it's so much more interesting and fascinating to watch those things come together. And I'm going to make it happen because I love that form, and I'm gonna write something someday that has multiple perspectives. I promise. So you have many books out. You want to kind of give us an overview of your body of work?
Yes, it really does. It is. I do have a lot of backlist. I warn you. I started out actually writing about ancient Rome. I had 4 books in first century imperial Rome. I then wrote 2 books that were set in the Italian Renaissance. It was originally intended to be 1 book, but I have a bad habit of massively overwriting my first drafts, and that book ended up turning into 2 because there was my poor editor explained it's going to be 900 pages if we put it all in 1 volume. So that became 2 books. And then after that, I had decided, I wanted a change for a variety of reasons. And that was when I found myself in the 20th century with the Alice Network. And The Alice Network was the book that ended up being a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick, which came out of absolutely nowhere. It was a big surprise to me, and quite a roller coaster. And then after that came The Huntress. And then after The Huntress, I have The Rose Code, which is about the female code breakers of Bletchley Park during World War II. And then most recently, The Diamond Eye, which is actually a book, again, about a Soviet woman war heroine. And I found her story while I was researching The Night Witches, because if you're researching one Soviet woman war heroine, a lot more tend to cross your timeline and your threshold of research. So that's where I found the plot idea for the most recent book, which is The Diamond Eye. And then in the middle of all that, I have also done a variety of collaborations, some which have been self-pubbed and a great deal of fun, taking place in the ancient world, and one which came out from Morrow in 2019, same year as The Huntress, which was about the joint told story about the women of the French Revolution. So I have my fingers in a lot of different pies in a lot of different historical eras, but I have found really that what fascinates me is unsung women of the past. It's less to me about what historical era I'm working in, and it's more about, I want to know, what were women doing back then and what were they up to? Because the chances are what they were doing is more interesting than the history books might tell you. I want to find ladies, regardless of what era I'm working in, who are so courageous and inspirational and cool, and that I end up, just gobsmacked at why I haven't heard more about them, in my school years, in my own reading. And I want to know more. I want to tell more about them. And I want to do my small part, to shine a light on them so they get more credit for the things that they've done. So that's what I look for. That's the thing that I look for to sort of light me up when I'm looking for what do I want to write next. And that tends to be what I find, because the thing is, these women did exist. They were out there. It's just that you have to sort of go digging in the cracks of history, because so much of history, if you're looking at where the focus front and center is, it's going to be written by the winners. It's going to be written by those in power. It's going to probably be written about men. And it's probably mostly going to be white men as well. So if you want other kinds of stories, you just have to go digging around the edges a little bit more to find them, but they are there.
Well, thank you for mining those stories. You now have a lifelong fan. I'm just amazed with your fascination and your willingness to do that work, to dig them up and put them in your stories. So you talked about how you started writing at the age of 7 or 8, and then how did you hone your craft?
I am almost entirely self-taught, I have to say. What I really did was I read a lot. I was the kid who was constantly reading, and more or less, who had to be basically chased off the couch and the book pried out of my hand if I was to go out and do something more active. Pretty much if you planted me somewhere with, a sufficient stack of books, as long as the books didn't run out, you could come back 3 days later and I'd still be in exactly the same place. So I was constantly reading from a young age. I was reading everything. And then I started writing, and I started writing stories of my own, and they were terrible, because they always are. Everybody's stories are terrible starting out. And there's a heavy dose of wish fulfillment, like most stories when you're getting started. Your characters are doing all the things that you want to do, or they have the things that you want to have. But after a while, you get beyond that, and you build what is your voice specifically, and not just you're not just the voice of whoever you're reading right now. I think everybody tends to be a little bit of a sponge when they start out. And so I read a lot, I wrote a lot, I wrote more, I edited, I analyzed, why is this working? Why is this not working? I read a lot of craft books. Stephen King's On Writing is still one of the best around. I just read a lot of,
Love it.
Basic how-to books, The Craft of Fiction. I very conscientiously took the advice from those books, and I sought out good books to read, and then I sought out bad books to read. Sometimes you can find out more easily from a bad example, like, oh, I see why this is important because this book isn't doing it and it doesn't work. So I am almost entirely self-taught that way. I have a lot of books under the bed. I ended up writing the book I wrote my freshman year of college, ended up being my very first novel that was published, but it was not my first novel that I ever finished. It was probably more like my 12th or 13th. I actually finished my first novel when I was 10, It was terrible, 121 double-spaced pages of pure awful, but it got me started. And then I kept on writing books all the way through my teen years, and I always had something going. And so that novel of Imperial Rome, which I started when I was 18. It didn't get pulled out and published until for years later and many revisions later. But that ended up being my first book, and that was really published. But I don't regret any of the ones that came before it. It was not wasted time. It was me learning my craft, and it's a little bit that old saying, which my mom said to me, and which I certainly take to heart, which is, you have to get 10,000 hours in to actually become good at something. I think that applies to writing as much as anything else. I just got started on my 10,000 hours rather early.
Man, that's a great story, and really informative about, the attitude that you need going into writing for sure. So you have been very successful. Which was the book that you feel launched your career as a writer?
It was definitely the Alice Network. That was the one that, for whatever reason, took off. And I don't know. I can never analyze, and I don't think anyone can, what makes one book take off and another one, not. I was very proud of all my books that came before that, and I still am. That one, I do think I found a little bit more luck with stories of the 20th century, because those tend to be more popular. At least they tend to be more popular at the time I was writing them, and I think they still are. But trends in historical eras come and go. It was, believe it or not, 15 years ago, people said that you couldn't sell a World War II novel to save your life. And now it seems like so much of the historical fiction is World War II centric nowadays. But I am always aware that historical eras do come and go. I do think that with the Alice Network, I did kind of happen to tap into something that was really blossoming as a trend. And it was a bit of, just good timing on my part that was not entirely deliberate. But I was looking, for what is it that people want to read? And I always look for that, because when you're looking to be a writer, not just to be a writer, but to be an author and to be hopefully paying some of your bills with your writing, you have to not just write the book of your heart, but you have to look at what are publishers publishing? What do readers want to read? Trends are important. And so therefore, I always do a certain amount of reading and research and analysis to try to find what is that sort of Venn diagram overlap, the sweet spot between what I am passionate about and want to write about, and what it is that people want to read and people are publishing. Looking for that overlap is, hopefully where one can manage to make a living. Although even then, it's a tough job to make a living in, I have to say. And that's what I tend to look for. But it is very important to be passionate about what you are writing about, because no one, I think, can successfully, at least not for long, churn out books they don't actually like just to make money or just to make a paycheck. That's not ever going to, I think, work very well. So you look for where the overlap is, and I look for those stories about women of the past, and the ones that maybe didn't get enough credit or enough spotlight during their lives, or even after their deaths, for the things that they've done.
As someone who has published as many books as you have, and who has hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of reviews, I feel like it's safe to ask someone like you this question on behalf of the writers who maybe don't have as many reviews yet, haven't published as many books. Even you, with your 4.8 stars, have some critical reviews. I went in and read some of them. I was like, did we read the same book? I'm so confused. Do you read your reviews? And if you do, what do you do with that?
I'll read some of the good ones, because, I get trade reviews sent to me by my, publishing team. It's like, hey, your book list review came in and it's great. Here it is. I don't go out and look for reviews. I tend not to. And if I especially get, if I'm tagged in a review, for example, and I see that it's a negative review, I have developed the discipline to say, okay, not finishing that. I'm putting it away right now. I don't read the bad ones. And I have learned to do that for my own sort of mental health, because the thing about writers is that we can read 99 good reviews and ignore all of them, and the one 2-star withering excoriating review gets in your head and rattles around up there and does some damage. And the thing is by the time a book is out, I can't do anything about changing it, really. I can maybe I can do maybe something small, like if someone pointed out, like, for example, someone pointed out to me that in the Huntress, one of the characters eats a piece of German chocolate cake, and someone pointed out, German chocolate cake actually wasn't invented for another couple of years. So I thought, oh, okay, I missed that, I have to admit. So I told my editor, for the future printings of the book and for the future, e-versions of the book, can we change the master file and just say chocolate cake instead of German cake? And she said, sure can. So things like that, I can maybe do something about. But the fact is, I can't change.
You can't unravel an entire plot line. Yeah.
I can't. So in that sense, feedback is not reviews are not useful to the writer. Reviews are for readers, which is why I'm never going to argue about a review with someone, or blast them for not liking my book, because that's your right. It is absolutely your right. But I don't need to be involved in the reviewing part, because you're writing that review for other readers. It's not really for writers. So I ignore reviews. I try my best. I try not to read them. I certainly I don't read negative ones, and that I have found enables me to stay sane in the whole reviewing process. I do get a little puzzled because, with social media being what it is, sometimes readers will tag you in bad reviews, and I wonder, why? I don't know why people do that. I mean, so I'm just like, okay,
this is cool.
You like it? Go on with your day. There are a lot of other books out there. Have fun finding one. But so sometimes there are things like that happen, and I just, sort of scratch my head and wonder why, and then I go on about my day. I do sometimes get the occasional rude DMs or emails to my author address, where people will want to contact me directly and tell me how much they hated a book. And that can also be a little puzzling. But every writer has that happen. So it's just like, it's part of this. It's part of the job.
Man, you have to have some thick skin. So, wow. I can't believe that people do that. That's just so. When I started this project, everything's called the Aviatrix Book Review, because I had this fantasy that someday I was going to do a comprehensive review of all the books ever written that featured women in aviation. And then when I started the book club and I actually researched how many there were, I was like, oh, well, never mind. I'm not going to do that. And then I started making friends with the authors, and I am not going to review the books of my friends after they are published. I am happy to provide critical feedback, as many of my friends are now on my novel, before it gets published, but I am not in the business of reviewing my friends, providing critical review of my friends' books. So I have to rebrand this whole thing because I'm not the Aviatrix Book Review. I am going to be the literary Aviatrix when I get my stuff together, because for that very reason. But I do think that reviews are important, especially if you like the book. Everybody go review the book and talk about how great it is, because reviews do help sell books. And it's like your tip for the author, so you can help them.
It is. And, the fact is that nobody has ever found a better way to sell books than word of mouth. Word of mouth is still the best publicity there is and ever will be, whether that word of mouth is, you talking on Instagram or on Facebook or on Twitter about your favorite books, or whether it's about simply talking to people in real life, on the phone or texting with your friends about, oh my God, please read this book. Word of mouth is still the best way.
That's so great. So you talked about not reading your reviews, but so what are the resources that you use as you're finishing the novel? Do you have beta readers or a peer group who helps you, make sure that your facts are correct?
Yeah, I have a wonderful editor. I also have a team of critique partners, 2 or 3 lovely ladies, depending on who's available, who are fellow historical fiction authors who have great, great eyes for fiction, and I trust them with my life. And even more, I trust them with my very, very, very first rough drafts, and they will tear it apart very nicely and help me fix the big picture stuff even before my editor sees it. And so I rely on them hugely, and that's where I fix the big picture stuff. My mother, actually, who is now a retired librarian and huge reader, is also one of my very first readers for anything that I write. And for anybody who says things like, it's like, well, if you just want to be told that your work is perfect, give it to your mom, and she'll be the one to tell you that. I just think, not my mom, and I mean that in a good way. She's always nice about it, but she has a great eye for pacing and character, and really a very good eye for prose. So she's always been a very valued person to get feedback from on my early drafts. And then with every book that I write, I almost always end up with some kind of experts who are beta readers to help me fact check and catch things in a particular in their particular field of expertise. I did have a couple of pilots read this book because I wanted to make sure that my flying details were correct. I actually did a flying session myself. I do not have a pilot license or anything like it, but I did a flying session myself in a World War II era biplane, which was a lovely Travel Air 4000 named Olive. And I liked the plane so much that not only did I ask the pilot to, it's fun flights in San Diego. I really recommend it if you ever want to do just a fun aviation flight. But I liked the plane so much that the pilot not only agreed to be one of those pilot beta readers for me, but I put the plane named Olive in the book in the big rescue scene at the end, where they do end up flying off in a blue and cream Travel Air 4000 named Olive. So that was a lot of fun. I flew in a biplane, and I asked many, many, many questions. And my pilot very obligingly flew bombing runs all over the hills of San Diego with me, and I learned so much about what it's like to be in open cockpit flying in those small and very noisy little planes. And then also for this book, I had a couple of firearms experts and a firearms expert and a doctor as well who were reading, because I needed medical details and gun details to be right. Which then led me to a very funny set of emails, and perhaps a little scary. And it just goes to show you that a writer's Google search history and email inbox can be a very scary place. And that is because, and I know this because it's like I had a literal email chain with a gun expert that kicked off with my email saying, how would you rig a shotgun to blow up in someone's face and kill them, but it make it look like an accident? And I swear to God, this is just for a book. And he answered beautifully. And we had a whole email chain about this, how to make it look like an accident. And I just ended up thinking like, oh boy.
That's such a great story. If you, for the next book that you write with a female aviator character, I just want you to know, we have a lot of beta readers who will offer their services to you. 130 writers in the Aviatrix Writers Book or Writers Group alone. And so I wanted to ask you, on their behalf, what advice do you have for writers and any lessons that you've learned on this journey, either writing or publishing?
Well, the thing I think I would tell you first and foremost, and it comes down to two quotes that kind of, one from my husband and one from the great Nora Roberts. And these two quotes sort of dovetail with each other. The one from my husband is, he's active duty Navy, and it's a phrase that he tends to use, which use with his junior guys, and he says, embrace the suck. And what that comes down to is embrace the suck. Yes, and I know you're a Coast Guard too, so it's like, I'm sure you've heard that as well. But the thing about that is that you need to allow yourself to be bad when you are getting started as a writer. And when you are getting started, not even just as a writer, but on any new project, you need to give yourself permission for that first draft to be terrible. Because it is going to be terrible. Everybody's first drafts are terrible. Mine are terrible. And you need to be okay with that. And the reason that is important is because I see so many first-time writers who get so intimidated by that voice in their head that says, this is terrible. What made you think you could write a book? You could never show this to anybody. What were you thinking? You should just give up right now. And they never get that book written. And they never get it off the ground. And that's the voice that you need to learn to stifle. Because, and here's the Nora Roberts quote, Nora Roberts, I believe, said something along the lines of, I can fix a bad page. I can't fix a blank page. And so that is important, because if you give yourself permission to be bad and just get that first draft out, get it done, you can fix it later. You can edit it and tinker it, and you can make it better. You can polish it up. I do that. Every writer I know does that. But you need to give yourself, first of all, the permission to be okay with the fact that it's going to be terrible to start. And then once you just let it be, get it out, let it be terrible, fix it later. So embrace the suck and let it be bad, because once you do, once you have it out there, it's not a blank page anymore. It's just a bad page, and you can fix it. So those are sort of the two dovetailing pieces of advice I have for, writers who are getting started, or even if you're not getting started, but you're starting something new, because it can feel, definitely discouraging to start out on something new, which seems bright and shiny and perfect in your mind. And then it's so very not perfect when you get it out there, but you just got to get it out there.
All of that resonates with me so much. I've been working on a novel for a long time, for several years, doing it around work, and then finally had the opportunity to retire and have worked on it full time for the past year and change. So I have been fighting that little voice every day, but I think I'm over the hump now. I'm over the hump on this one, and I know now what it's going to feel like next time, and so I'm managing that too. That was all great advice.
And that's the thing, it's, even if you've written a book before, you can start a new one and think, because I think this with every book, where I end up thinking, how many books have I written? How do I not know how to write a book by now? When am I going to know? When is it going to get less difficult? And the answer is, it won't. Every book, when you start it, or when, at some point when you're, hitting the slog in the middle, or at some point you're going to end up thinking, how do I not know how to do this? How am I not doing this better by now? But the fact is, you are getting better. It's just that nothing is ever going to be entirely easy.
Oh, you're giving everybody so much hope right now. Thank you. I mean that seriously, because you are confessing to still struggling with these things as an accomplished writer, as you are, but you are accomplished. And so that gives us all hope. So is there anything that you're working on now that you're willing to talk about, or any passion or interest that's been tugging at you that you haven't had a chance to write about that you want to talk about?
I'm actually working on two things right now, and I am really excited about both of them. I am writing one co-authored story with my friend, the Canadian author Janie Chang, and we are writing about two women, a Chinatown laundress and a New York opera singer, whose lives intersect in the chaos of the San Francisco earthquake, and then beyond, all the way leading up to the party of the century in Versailles in 1912. That is called The Phoenix Crown, and that is going to be out hopefully next fall, if we meet our deadline. So that's one, and that's an idea I've had tickling in the back of my head for quite a while now. And then I also have next novel for me is just alone, is right now titled The Briar Club, and that takes place in an all-female boarding house in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s. So we're talking, the Cold War, McCarthyism, the Red Scare, all of that dark, gritty, and rather delicious territory, at least delicious if you're a novelist. So that's the two things sort of that I'm working on now. That one should come out the following year, 2024, probably in the springtime, March or April.
Oh, they both sound fascinating, and I'm so excited to read those too. Was there anything that you wanted me to ask you that I didn't?
No, honestly, I think we've had a great talk.
Kate, I want to just say thank you so much for your time, for bringing your passion for history, your writing skill to this fabulous story, The Huntress, and for including our night witches in it and bringing that history to such a giant audience because of your voice. I appreciate it so much. All the ladies in aviation appreciate it. I'm excited to talk about this in the book club. We have a couple of meetings coming up. Elizabeth Wein and Amy Goodpaster Strebe, who wrote that comparative history, are going to both join us at the end of the month for that discussion, which I'm excited about. Kate Quinn, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me on here just to chat about the book and about women in aviation. And I'm so glad that there is such an interest in these, pioneers and the things that they've done and the heights that they soared to. So please keep reading and keep talking about them, because this is, it's a wonderful thing for me to hear, is that there is such interest in these ladies as well.
Thanks so much for listening. I'd like to thank the Women's Soar Group for their assistance in producing this interview. The Women's Soar Group is a media company that gives women a platform to express themselves. Please join us in the Aviatrix Book Club next month when we will discuss They Called Me Sky Hunter by Canadian bush pilot Miriam Huser. Blue skies and happy reading.